class. So today we are going to do the nervous anatomy, and then tomorrow I'll post the nervous lecture, and then next week we'll have the special senses. So special senses is kind of a continuation of the nervous system, special kind of nervous tissue, if you will. Once I go through with these models, I'm going to just flip through some other slides related to both nervous and special senses anatomy. I'm not going to talk. I'm just going to flip through the slides. Much of that information will be repeated when I do the lecture, but I loaded those slides and it won't hurt to post them here so that you can get an advanced look if you want to do that. You don't have to do that. I also want to remind you that your presentation over your case study and the paper that's associated with that is coming due. So make sure that you get that in. Okay, I'm going to turn me off and we're going to get started. Okay, so this is a neuron, and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, and I'm going to put some lines here and see what you can identify. We talked about this when we talked about tissue. Well, how much of that can you identify? If you need to enlarge your screen, hit those 4 arrows that are pointing out to make it larger. So let's start here. This is the soma or cell body of the cell. So that's all of this large part. And then the long part that extends is called the axon. Okay. Now, the connection between the cell body and the axon is here, and it's called the axon hillock. Okay. There are some extensions that lead to the cell body, so they've been truncated on here, but these are called dendrites. At the end of the axon are axon terminals, and at the end of the axon terminals are terminal buttons. Now, the axon is wrapped with this yellow beige color stuff. These are cells called Schwann cells. And the Schwann cells release layers of this material here. And so this material that they release is called myelin. In between each Schwann cell, and you see the Schwann cells wrap around and around and release this insulating substance called myelin. In between the Schwann cells, those spaces are referred to as nodes of Ranvier. Okay. Now, the other thing that I have not identified on this model is this. And I want to just zoom in on that for a second. This is where an axon terminal from another neuron is touching the cell body of this neuron. So this part right here is an axon terminal and terminal button from another neuron that is touching the cell body. That whole connection is called a synapse. Okay, that's a synapse. So if I ask you what that whole thing is, you're going to say a synapse. If I ask you what this is, that's a terminal button. This is an axon terminal from a different neuron, but it is touching or synapsing with this neuron. Okay, so the whole thing is a neuron. Or nerve cell. A nerve is not the same as a neuron. A nerve is actually a bundle of several neurons. Okay, but sometimes the term neuron and nerve is used interchangeably. But this is a nerve cell or a neuron. And they are specialized for conducting or passing impulses. This is the same thing, just a different model, and it's cut off. So they cut here, right, from here. So I'm just going to do some dots on here to identify the things we talked about already. This is my cell body. These are dendrites. This is the axon hillock. This is the axon. These are the Schwann cells. And this is the myelin. And these areas here are the nodes of Ranvier. Okay. And then here is a synapse. Let's do it again. This is the cell body. This is a dendrite. This is the axon hillock. This is the axon. These are Schwann cells that secrete myelin. And this is the node of Ranvier. This is a synapse where you have the terminal button and the axon terminal from a different neuron touching this neuron. Okay. So this is the brain, and the brain has three main areas: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. Cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. So what we're looking at here, this is all cerebrum. Okay. And the cerebrum has lobes similar to the bones and muscles we named in similar areas. At the frontal lobe, have the temporal lobe. We have the occipital lobe. And we have the parietal lobe. Okay. Now, you have these raised areas and you have these depressions. And I'm going to zoom in. And these raised areas are called one thing, and the depressed areas are called another thing. Raised areas, each one is a gyrus. And the depressed areas, each one is a sulcus. Okay. So you have the sulcus is the depression, the raised area is the gyrus. Each side is referred to as a hemisphere. And so this line dividing the hemispheres is called the longitudinal fissure. Okay. Now, my parietal lobe, I labeled it at an odd kind of a place, but there is a central sulcus here, this depression here, and it divides kind of anterior and posterior. Precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. Okay, so this is the central sulcus. This is a precentral gyrus, and I am just abbreviating that because I don't have space, but you won't abbreviate it. And then this is the post. Okay, central gyrus. Okay. So same thing, we have our lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, right? This is the cerebellum, and this is the brainstem. Okay. The brainstem has two parts, the pons and the medulla, or medulla oblongata. Okay. So let's zoom in on this. Okay. So we have this. We have this. We have this. We have this. 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 Okay. Now, this area is the midbrain, and I don't get into talking about the different parts of the midbrain with regards to diencephalon and mesencephalon and that kind of stuff. You won't ever see this separate other than maybe a dissection, but you need to understand some of these things in place. So the two hemispheres are held together by this corpus callosum. That's this band of tissue across here. And then there's a thin membrane underneath it. The thin membrane is a wall that is a barrier to a ventricle, and a ventricle is a space that's holding some fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. This membrane is called the septum pellucidum. And so that's the little wall there separating the lateral ventricles, and we'll see those lateral ventricles, or this is the pituitary gland, and then where we have 34, that area is associated with the pituitary gland in that it produces hormones that are stored and released from the pituitary gland. And then this area 33 is along with 34, creates, well, along with this other line here, creates a wall to another ventricle, the third ventricle. So if I label this and I ask for the space, I'm going to want the ventricle. But right now, I'm identifying the structure. So this is called the hypothalamus. This is the thalamus. And this is the epithalamus. And at the back of this area where you have the epithalamus, there's a pineal gland. The pineal gland, the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus we'll also talk about when we get to the endocrine system. These are hormone producing and releasing structures. Okay. So we are looking at the underside of the brain, and we can see the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe, the cerebellum, the pons, the brainstem. This is the pituitary gland. But we also see some nerves here, cranial nerves. Okay. And so let's see what we can identify here. Okay. I wanted to kind of label these first. You can see that they have Roman numerals on them. So, of course, when you have the test, you'll have the side that's not identified. But there are 12, and you need to know them in order, right? So, let's some information up here. So you need to know the Roman numeral, and you need to be able to place these, and we'll in the lecture we'll talk about what they're for. So number 1 is olfactory. Let's do. And then 2 is optic. And then 3 is ocular motor. And then 4, trochlear. And then 5 is trigeminal. And then 6 is abducens. And then 7 is facial. And then 8 can be presented this way, or a V with 3 lines after it. And so then 8 is vestibular cochlear. It doesn't seem like I spelled it right, but then 9, glossopharyngeal. 10 is vagus. 11, accessory. And 12, hypoglossal. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so we got our olfactory, we got optic, we got ocular motor, We got trochlear. You can see it here and over here. We got trigeminal. You can see that here and over here. We got abducens. You can see here and here. We got facial. You can see here and here. So all of these are on both sides. Vestibular cochlear. You can see just under that. I'll label it over here too. And then you got glossopharyngeal. You can see here. Vagus. You can see here and here. All right, you can see them on both sides. Hypoglossal here. And then accessory, sorry. And then hypoglossal is here. Okay. Same thing, different model. Okay. Same thing. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And so you can actually follow them back numerically. So that might help you. Okay. So when you name them olfactory, optic, ocular motor, trochlear, trigeminal, abducens, facial, vestibular cochlear, vagus, accessory, hypoglossal. Okay. So we got these lobes. You already identified these lobes. The cerebellum. This whole thing is the brain stem. Right? And then you got the pons, the medulla. You can see some of the cranial nerves from this view as well. That's the pituitary gland hanging out right there. Depression, sulcus, raised area gyrus. This is that longitudinal fissure. You can see where you kind of separate here this central sulcus and your pre-central gyrus, post-central gyrus. Same thing. We've seen other views. You can see some of the cranial nerves here. Okay, one thing I wanted to point out on this one is the white matter arrangement inside of the cerebellum. This is called the arbor vitae. So the specific, let's change the color. The specific look of this white matter inside of the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae, which means tree of life. Come on. Okay. I want to point out some spaces in here. So we name the areas, But this space right here is the third ventricle. This space right here is the cerebral aqueduct. And this space right here is the fourth ventricle. Okay, so let's label these spaces. Okay. Here over the third ventricle, there's one over the fourth ventricle and in the lateral ventricle too. You just can't see them on this particular model. This is called a choroid plexus, the network of blood vessels. And the choroid plexus is responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. So this space is my third ventricle. This space is the cerebral aqueduct. This space is my fourth ventricle. This is to demonstrate gray matter and white matter. Let's zoom in and we can appreciate it down here even better. And so this is part of the cerebrum. You see the gray matter is towards the outside, the white matter is towards the inside. So on the brain, the gray matter is more superficial or more peripherally located. The white matter is more centrally located or deeper. In the spinal cord, it is the opposite. In the spinal cord, it's the opposite. Okay. Things we have looked at. I'm going to just zoom in a little bit and put some lines and you see what you can name. Can you name any of these things? So now if I said, what is this space? The space is the third ventricle. What is the wall? The wall is the thalamus. So I'm going to space. third ventricle. Okay. In the center of the area here is the intermediate mass. I don't even know if that is on your list. I'm not going to stress out about that one. Okay, let's see. These are the ventricles. So if I were to take a mold of the spaces in the brain, in each hemisphere, we have these spaces that are oddly shaped. So it kind of, let me use my pencil here. The lateral ventricles have horns. So the lateral ventricle comes around like this. We aren't going to name the horns. And then under here is the third ventricle. That's the cerebral aqueduct. And this is the fourth ventricle. Okay. So let's label these. This is the same model, just a different view. And this just allows you to see that you'll have one lateral ventricle in each hemisphere, third ventricle in between, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. Same model. This is just showing you a close-up of that third ventricle because it's hard to see on a picture. Notice these little pink areas here. Those represent the choroid plexus within each of those lateral ventricles. And then you'd have one here in the third ventricle and then also at the fourth ventricle. Again, those are for the production of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so this is a cross section through the spinal cord. Through the spinal cord. And so we're looking down on top if we cut through. And I'm going to put some labels here. Okay. So we already said that the gray matter and the white matter is located differently in the spinal cord in the brain. And so then in the brain. So this is the white matter. That is more superficial, and the gray matter, which is deeper. And in the center is a central canal through which cerebrospinal fluid passes. Now, this is the spinal nerve. And that's created because you have these two sides come together. This is called the ventral root. And this is called the dorsal root. So this helps you know front from back, right? So the ventral is the anterior side, And the dorsal is the posterior side, right? So this is posterior back here. What is going on with my text box? Right, and I know that because of this thing right here. The dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root doesn't have that. The dorsal root ganglion. And so what we're going to end up doing is talk about a reflex arc, and there's a specific flow where we go in here through this dorsal root ganglion, through the dorsal root into the gray matter. And then we have a synapse. Remember, we talked about synapses. We have a connection that happens in here. And sometimes that connection involves another neuron called an association neuron or an interneuron. Sometimes it doesn't. And then we go back out our ventral root like that. That's going to be our reflex arc. And so we go, the spinal nerve is really short, and then it gives a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. So that's where we see the curved areas here, where we have one going in one direction and one going in the other. We got a dorsal ramus here and a ventral ramus here. Don't worry about that. But this is the spinal nerve, this part. And then we have the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion. Then the synapse is always going to happen in the gray matter. Then we have the ventral root, and then that will lead to the spinal nerve, and then the ventral ramus. Okay. Same thing. Different view. Okay. We won't name a bunch of nerves, but there are plexi or plexuses or groups of nerves that I want you to appreciate that come off the spinal cord and cluster together. So we have one here, which is called the cervical plexus, and we have one here that's called the brachial plexus. Okay. I'm going to move it down. We're going to see two more. Lumbar plexus and the sacral plexus. You can see that in perspective. And let's go back up. There's a nerve that comes off the cervical plexus that travels down, and they're not showing it on this side, they're showing it on this side, but it's on both sides. This nerve is going to run all the way down to the diaphragm, and it's going to happen on both sides. Okay, that nerve is called the phrenic nerve. That nerve is super important because it innervates the diaphragm, and you need the activity of the diaphragm in order to breathe. And so sometimes people get spinal cord injuries, that cause them to be paraplegic or quadriplegic. And if you get that spinal cord injury up high enough, not only would you be a quadriplegic, you would not be able to breathe. And my students now are way too young to know one of the men who used to play Superman named Christopher Reeves. It was years and years and years ago. He played Superman, and he got in a horseback riding accident and broke his neck. and he was on a ventilator for the rest of his life in a wheelchair because he had spinal cord injury up high enough so that he wasn't getting any signal to that phrenic nerve and couldn't breathe. Okay. There are a number of nerves that come off of each plexus, and I think I have close up. Close up pictures of these models, so we'll look at those to identify. Why is this thing acting crazy? To identify these different areas. Okay, let's look at some of these that come off of the brachial plexus. We have the axillary nerve. We have musculocutaneous nerve. We have the radial nerve. Median nerve. And then we have the ulnar nerve. Okay. One thing I want to point out while I'm on this particular picture, you see this is the spinal cord. And then after the ribs, it stops being a cord and it becomes a bunch of just nerves bundled together. That continues down is called the cauda equina. So where the spinal cord stops being a cord, that doesn't make that any more clear. Let me just move it up and label it. That is called the cauda equina. Which means horse's tail. Okay. Go to the next one. Okay, so you can follow these nerves down and see where they end up. And actually, it's easy to see on this side where they associate with the bone. So then you have radial, ulnar, median. Okay. Now let's look at these here. Okay, so we have coming off of the lumbar plexus, we have what's referred to as the obturator nerve. And the obturator nerve goes through the obturator foramen. It's hard to visualize that, but when you see this nerve, it comes down and it goes through this opening right here. And then there's one over here and it goes through this opening here. And so the angle of the picture doesn't let you fully appreciate that. But that's the obturator nerve. And then the femoral nerve comes down off of that plexus as well and goes through the anterior of the thigh. Then off of the sacral plexus, one of the main nerves here is that sciatic nerve. Okay. let's see if I can see anything else on here. Okay, so this is the saphenous nerve. Saphenous nerve. There's a vein that is also superficial and medial. That's the saphenous vein or great saphenous vein. This is that sciatic nerve, and it comes down and goes behind the knee and the posterior of the leg. And so you see that here. Let's see if we have another picture. Let's zoom back out so you can appreciate those things. Okay. Let me see. Okay, I'm just going to label a couple of these. This is tibial nerve, sural nerve, and I'm not sure if it is on your list, but this one running down the fibula is the fibular nerve. And this one we pointed to somewhere else, but it runs the whole length. This is saphenous. Okay. Okay, I think that was it. So I'll go back through these. And then I'm going to go through those other slides just so that you can see them. Okay. Okay, so I will then post the lecture over the nervous material on tomorrow, maybe tonight, but definitely tomorrow. And then next week, we'll go over the anatomy for special senses and the lecture. All of the model pictures are already posted in the discussion board. So you want to make sure you take a look at those. Any questions you have, jot them down. Please email me.